Good evening, I'm Shanatha Rahman and you're watching Analyze. नाज़रीन, आज का शो जो है वो हम लोग अंग्रेज़ी में करेंगे। अमूमन तज्जिया जो है उर्दू में किया जाता है क्योंकि हमारे साथ आज एक बड़ी इम्पोर्टेंट एक ऑथर हैं जिनकी किताबें मजहबी अमूर पे जो लिखी गई हैं उनको पूरी दुनिया में पढ़ा जाता है। और उसके साथ साथ ये मैं ज़रूर कहूँगी कि ये पाकिस्तान इसलिए आई हैं क्योंकि इनके दिमाग में जो एक आइडिया इन्होंने कंसीव किया था चार्टर ऑफ कंपैशन का कि हमदर्दी के तहत अगर हमदर्दी के साथ पूरी दुनिया में मजहबी जमातें और लोग चलें तो तभी दुनिया आगे जा सकती है। Thank you very much for having taken out the time to join us.
It's a pleasure.
And I'm truly grateful that you've actually taken out the time. I hope I summed up the core values
Excellent, yes.
of compassion. But having said that, I want to start off with this. There has been a lot of resistance to this idea of compassion that you quite rightly are promoting in a world where it is very much needed. You have been criticized for saying that you take a very soft stance on Islamic fundamentalism, so to say, or that you're looking for the commonality that sort of is there, but for some reason a lot of people, for instance, have clearly resisted this thing by saying, like Sam Harris, for instance, who says that you have a very benign view of Islam, contending that Islam is currently understood and practiced by vast numbers of world Muslims, is anti-ethical to civil society. How is it to face this sort of resistance with the very compassion that you are advocating?
Well, I don't take much notice of this, really. My studies have convinced me that the virtue of compassion lies at the heart of every single religious tradition, not just Islam, but Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity and Judaism. Every single one of them has formulated what's often called the Golden Rule. Confucius was the first to do so, and he was asked by his disciples, what can we put into practice all day and every day? And what is the central thread that runs through all your teaching? And he said, shu, which means likening to the self. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anyone else. Never impose on others, said Confucius, what you yourself do not desire.
The biblical context of that would be do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yes, yes. Rabbi Hillel said that when approached by a pagan who promised to convert to Judaism on the spot, if the rabbi could recite the whole of Jewish teaching while he stood on one leg. And Hillel stood on one leg and said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. That is the Torah, and everything else is only commentary. Go and study it. And of course the Prophet Muhammad said, not one of you can be a believer unless he desires for his neighbor what he desires for himself. Now, this is difficult to do, and so, not surprisingly, people fall short of this endless preoccupation with compassion that's supposed to happen all day and every day, not just when you feel like it. It requires you, as our charter says, to dethrone yourself from the center of your world and put another there, all day and every day. In so doing, you leave the ego behind and reach out towards the other. But it has to be, it's not just a question of nice, sloppy feeling. It has to be incorporated into practical action, always. Writing a book about scripture at the moment in all religious traditions, and they all insist on this crucial, essential virtue, but it also insists that religion is not just some private little search, but it requires this
outward display or action that actually shows that you are acting upon what you believe.
And it must make an impact on society.
Well, coming back to society in Pakistan currently, post 9/11, and since Pakistan has been part of the so-called war on terror, which is now Pakistan's own battle that it must fight, there is a feeling within Pakistan that the people of Pakistan feel that the world in general looks at Pakistan as an extremist model, and in that accusation of extremism, they very often feel that the loss that has been suffered, not just financially, but emotionally, to the people of Pakistan, is not being viewed with a very compassionate prism.
I would agree. I mean, it's not just Pakistan that is suffering too. I mean, Muslims throughout the world have been vilified, as Sam Harris has just showed us, since 9/11 and the recurrent terrorist attacks. But we have to see that a lot of these young men who are doing these crimes, criminal activities, that's what they are, have very little understanding of Islam or the Quran. Many of them are new converts, and many of them have suffered a sense that have joined Islam because they felt rejected by their own
felt
society.
marginalized within their own society, so this was their sense of being part of a larger collective.
Yes.
Okay. You've also, I was listening to an interview of yours where you were asked if religion was the cause of the major conflicts, and I would agree with you when you say it's not religion, it's a battle for resources, it's economics, it's ego, it's power. And religion is a tool that is used to facilitate that quest for power, resources, economics.
And let's face it, we're a very violent species. We may not think we are, but we are violent. Look at the history of the 20th century. And when we look at the history of the 20th century, we look at the two world wars. They were not fought for religion. They were fought for secular nationalism. And nationalism is a kind of religiosity. People feel that it gives them an identity. When the national anthem goes, their hearts pound, their eyes fill with tears, and they feel that they belong in a community. The nation state was a creation of the 19th century. It was possible only when modern communications had made a country like Britain, for example, or America, far a country like America, and unless there were newspapers, how could anyone feel that they shared a national spirit? You know, if you're up in Boston, how would you feel at all related or know anything about people living in Florida? So it is a modern invention, and it was very important in sort of helping our industrial success. But very early in the process, Lord Acton, a British historian, said in the late 19th century that the nation state had a chilling fault. The emphasis, he said, on ethnicity, culture, and language would make it very difficult indeed for those who did not fit the national profile. In some cases, he said, they could even be enslaved or exterminated. Now that was with chilling accuracy. It was not long afterwards that we had the Armenian massacres by the atheistic Young Turks who wanted to create a purely Turkic state. We had the Nazi Holocaust, a determination to rid the German people of Jews, and Bosnia was the most recent catastrophe. In Serbia, you have a horrible mix of a weird form of Christianity mixed up with some very crude Serbian nationalism. And if you think of Hiroshima, that bomb was not dropped for religious reasons. It was a pragmatic way to try to end a world war that was causing multiple deaths, and a lot of innocent people died. So to just dump it all on religion is people are really not wanting to look closely at their own political, the secular violence. And we've got, as I say, we are a violent species. We have always killed one another, as well as other.
For the very reasons as you've mentioned. Having said that, I do see a shift. I remember immediately after post 9/11, there was a lot of talk about the clash of civilizations. That was an idea that became very prevalent. And now, a decade after, almost 2 decades after now, we're in 2018, I see people aware and turning towards the same idea that you are now.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
was operating at the beginning of a terrible period in Chinese history called the Warring States period, where the many, many little states and principalities on the Great Plain of China fought one another with horrible casualties for about 300 years, with ever-increasing weaponry and efficiency, until only one of them was left. And that became the Chinese Empire. It was a hideous experience. And after Confucius, another philosopher, Mozi, looked at this, and he was very much involved in peacekeeping. He was interested in military equipment, and he'd go around helping the vulnerable states to defend themselves against the increasingly powerful states who were about to slaughter them all. And he said, it's not enough to just be nice to one another. We have to have yan ai, which means concern for everybody. It's sometimes translated universal love, but that's a bit too emotional for Mozi, who was a brutally practical man. And he said that we have to see the other as the self. And if a king saw a neighboring king, and saw his state as their own, they would not go to war. We have to look at one another and see that they are like us.
What you're saying, Karen, would absolutely resonate with anyone who even has an iota of humanity or empathy within them. But I have to say, what is the practical application? I understand, of course, that this charter is setting up schools, communication between countries, and how to help within the healthcare system, and there is a practical approach, but that's at a micro level. What you're talking about is a larger idea for nations to think this way, for our leaders to think this way, to have that responsibility within them. How do you take this and implement it there?
Look,
it's a tough one.
it is a tough one, and I am no Confucius, and even Confucius didn't manage it in his day. He was a failure.
Well, I don't know if Confucius was taught in most theology classes all over the world, but you know, at that point when he was alive,
yes.
In this global age you are, so you do have that voice, and you are part of the academia, and you are heard, and you are on TV, so
everybody has to do what they can.
okay.
And you have to start somewhere. And I have to say that streets ahead of everybody else working for the Charter is Pakistan, right on the cusp of so many of the problems that tear our world apart. And so, whereas nothing is happening in London, where everyone is complacently going on in their usual way, but here in Pakistan, they've achieved extraordinary things. I've been thrilled at what I've seen this week.
I'd like to ask you, is it possible, because when you say that there's extraordinary work happening in Pakistan, and prior to the interview I was asking you whether Pakistan is number 2 from what I've read, and you said, no, absolutely, it's number 1 as far as the kind of work that is going on in Pakistan regarding this chapter. One of the issues that Pakistan faces is having a homogeneous educational system where, with reforms, the madrasas should be included within streamlined educational systems. Would this charter be willing to somehow work on this to actually help assimilate the madrasas into mainstream education so that the children studying there also have a knowledge of what's happening in the rest of the world? Is that a possibility?
Yes, of course. I mean, already what has been achieved here has been extraordinary. I mean, the Charter, which started out as a little group, are now controlling, running thousands of, hundreds of schools in Sindh, with the cooperating with the Sindh government. And one of the big problems of Pakistan is the huge imbalance of wealth. The poor and the rich. Just last couple of days ago, I went to the opening of a new project. It's called Bridges. It's one of the big bridges, traffic bridges in Pakistan, which the team saw and said, look, there's a lovely space under here. It was filled with rubble and dirt and drug addicts. But they managed to persuade the council, hard-headed council members, to let them have that space. But a whole lot of people put money into this, and we went to open it. It's called Bridges.
Okay.
And on one side of this bridge, you have a very affluent society. On the other, you have an extremely poor society. I looked at, and now underneath this bridge is being turned into a beautiful facility. The children from the poorer neighborhoods are coming in now to learn, and they were all sitting at lovely little desks, and students from the university volunteering to teach them Urdu, mathematics, English, writing, math, cricket. Cricket will...
Recreation is extremely important.
Hugely important. So they're also bridging the gaps in society, the affluent gaps. The affluent and the poor. A rickshaw driver gave a speech, and he was in tears. He openly wept, and he said, we've had nowhere to go. Now we have this.
Okay, so from what I have read, I heard that your mother, who was a homemaker, went to work when there was a financial situation at home and money had to be made, and that was quite inspirational to you growing up. And so when we look at women in parts of the world who, like Pakistan for instance, who have never really entered the workforce before, but they are 50% of the population.
Yes, my mother felt very resentful that she had not had an education. She was a clever woman. And when my father went bankrupt and she had to go to work, She managed to get a job at the medical school in Birmingham. And then her mind started to wake up. And she realized, I could have done this. I could have been a doctor. And so there was, I think she was quite distressed by the fact that she had...
That she didn't have the education?
Yes, and that she could have done much more with her life.
But don't you think it was pretty amazing for that day and time to not have the education and to be able to get a job and to be able to provide for your family?
Of course it was.
Because that wasn't something that was expected.
Of course it was. This was the 1950s, but it was not an easy journey for her.
It wasn't an easy journey.
No, it wasn't. And I loved my mother dearly, but she was not an easy woman, and she was not interested at all in my work.
In your work. Well, you also mentioned something about your grandmother. I'm going to come back to that. We have to go to a short break. Please keep watching. See you after this break.
हयात है और प्यास मौत है। पानी का एहसास करें, खत्म यहाँ से प्यास करें, कदम बढ़ाएं, डैम बनाएं।
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing your mother and that she had to go back to work. And I'd like to discuss a little bit about, when we look at a person, especially a person who's extremely successful, which you are by any benchmark, you have that body of work, you have the charter of compassion, you are extremely driven and hopeful about what you feel. So we feel that, at least I feel that ferocity is strength, the hope, the desire. Was it always like this?
No.
Or how difficult has the journey been? Because the question for me is very relevant, because the audience that's watching this will seem to think that it's not as hard as it seems, but there is always a story.
Yes, there is a story. I went into a convent. It was a stupid thing to do because I was far too young to do anything of that sort. It was a kind of rebellion. And I stayed 7 years, and I left a broken person. I had a breakdown and was for years really disturbed. I was at Oxford University and I got a very good first degree in English literature. Then I went on to do a PhD and failed it.
And there was a reason behind your thesis.
There was a scandal.
There was a scandal.
Yes.
What was the scandal?
That basically in Oxford, if you fail a thesis, you're supposed to write a detailed report. Saying exactly, step by step, why this happened. And this man, a very successful, brash young Don, wrote only 4 lines, saying that this was, I was a clever young woman, but this was not, in his view, a PhD subject. And so that was the end of that.
That was the end of that.
The faculty argued about it for 5 months, and eventually the head of the faculty, Dame Helen Gardner, said that she was very sorry for me, Miss Armstrong, an injustice had been done, but the sanctity of the doctorate meant that I couldn't have it re-examined.
And how old were you by then?
I was coming up for 30.
So that was that. So the first 30 years of your life have not really been the easiest.
No, there was worse. I mean,
okay.
I was.
And then you start working.
No. I went.
Because your first book was published much later.
In 1982.
Right. So what happened then?
Well, I published it while I was still a school teacher, this book, and then I got a job out of the blue, writing and presenting a 6-part documentary on St. Paul for Channel 4, which was a new channel. BBC wouldn't have touched me with the barge books, I had no experience. But that was the beginning of a change in me, because by this time I hated religion. And I was also suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, which was not diagnosed and had some very frightening symptoms. And it was only when I was 32 that finally I got to a doctor who said this was appalling, it was a classic case. And I was having very, very frightening symptoms, and I looked a haunted wreck. So I worked in television for a while, and that was good. Then that ended in disaster too, because the Israeli film company that I was working with embezzled all the money that Channel 4 gave them to start a new series after 3 years' work. So by this time, I was nearing 50. And yet again, everything I seemed to do went crashing to the ground. And I went off and decided I'd write a book called A History of God. And I was still very, very angry about religion. And I expected this book to take the skeptical line of its predecessors, my first books. And I would show how people had simply rejigged the idea of God to suit them whenever it was convenient. But I was now alone, living in a very remote part of London. My television friends had, because of the scandal, had melted away. And there was only me and the text and a lot of silence. There was no crew to urge me on to be outrageous. And the text started to become more meaningful. Because, you see, theology is poetry. And you cannot read a poem meaningfully in a noisy nightclub. You need a certain brain set. And I was finding that when I was reading it in this more silent way, the text started to speak to me in a new way. And I began to see how very, very inadequate my idea of God had been up until this point. The sort of God that one was handed to by the catechism. God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. That didn't mean much to me when I was 8 years old, but I now think it's completely incorrect, because God is not a being, God is being itself. And you cannot possibly define God as Ibn Sina, Maimonides, Thomas Aquinas, all insisted.
What's fascinating though is, and I'm so glad that you are so honest about sharing this with everyone, is that up until 50, you were actually going through a very difficult phase of your life. And that in itself, I believe, is inspirational to people who seem to think, in this day and age, with instant food, instant texting, instant noodles, that success has to be instant. If you haven't made it by the time you're in your 20s, it's over. I'm in a crisis. I'm never going to bounce back. But here's a story of resistance. And
yet, you see, I look back on it and I see that all those earlier phases of my life that seemed to be so disastrous and made me so ill. I was anorexic too. I couldn't eat and all that. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. I see now that every phase of that time was leading up to what I have now. I went, my study of texts and interpretation of texts that I was doing studying English literature has been invaluable to me. My teaching when teaching children, has helped me to make complex things easy for people. You can't just read a lecture to a group of children. You have to come down and make it accessible to them. And how lucky that I failed that PhD. I've had a much more interesting life than I would have had if I'd been teaching 19th century literature in a minor British university. So what is it, do you think, the same way you say that compassion is the core that unifies people and religion across boundaries? What is it in your personal journey? What is that one characteristic that keeps you resilient, hopeful, keeps you going? My study. I study every day from 9 until 6, every day at my desk, taking copious notes. And I'm not good at praying. Someone asked me yesterday if I'd ever had an experience of God, and I said no. But there are moments when, in my study, when I will have intimations of oratio or prayer, just little intimations, because you're immersed in these wonderful texts, and they start to speak to you. And I found that I learned from other traditions like Judaism and Islam how to look at my own Catholic tradition in a more benign way. I could see they helped me to see what my own tradition had been trying to do and had got waylaid. This religion's very hard to do well. It is an art form, I think, and we know that art can be variable from extremely wonderful to banal and
well, it's also relative.
yes. But what I learned from Judaism, for example, never to stop asking questions. To keep on asking difficult questions and never stop, never take anything for granted. From Islam, I learned about the pluralism of the Quran, the generosity with which the Quran speaks about the religions of Abraham, the previous prophets, and very early I came upon this text of Ibn Arabi, and I immediately copied it down and put it on my bulletin board. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to recognize the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipotent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. This made a huge impression upon me, and I began to see the unity of the religious quest. Each tradition has its own particular genius, and each has its own particular difficulties and failings, because religion and the golden rule of compassion are very hard to do well.
But if you're looking at the history of religion, of course there's compassion. There are social justice models in each religion.
Yes.
And yet, even today, we haven't seen them being applied in their true spirit. What is it that holds us back?
Largely, I think it's partly to do with the state. The state depends, the pre-modern state depended upon the suppression of 90% of the population and the creation of a tiny aristocracy comprising about 10% of the population, who had the leisure to study and create the arts and sciences on which our progress depended. And historians tell us that without this iniquitous system, we'd never have advanced beyond a subsistence level, because it created a leisured class who were able to develop the arts and sciences and take us forward and progress. Otherwise, we'd have stayed at a primitive level. And so, and now the same, you know, so but they were always from very early days in Mesopotamia, in what's now Iraq, the earliest of these civilizations, there were always people who cried out against it, who said this is unjust. Poets, the great poets of Mesopotamia, and Confucius was doing the same thing. Hillel and Jesus were doing the same thing. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was also crying out against the injustice of an infant market economy in Mecca. And so these voices were there, and they created a counter movement. And I was concerned that there weren't any of those voices today. The Charter was an attempt to make
so
that
the counter movements, these voices were counter movements, and they started the counter movements to the prevalent situation there. And for a while, they were able to make a difference. And with time, the core values were diluted, or simply used, again, as a means of power.
Yes,
and that is where we are today.
Yes.
So
that's what we do.
or is it a cycle?
No, it's what we are. We humans,
It's what we are.
We human beings have a genius for spouting beautiful things up. And that's what happens. But there always were people who kept that voice going. The Confucians, for example, remained in government at the head of the civil service, keeping the ideal of compassion to the fore right up until the 1911 revolution. Now, they couldn't prevail against the military, but they were there, and that voice was powerful, and many of the Confucians died for their brave stance against this. So I think throughout history there have been these voices that call out prophetically against injustice, cruelty, oppression, and we need to make those voices louder and give them the means whereby to speak.
So this is, like I said, so then this is a cycle where humanity is cruel, and to be brought back to the core value of compassion, there will have to be same voices prevailing time and again.
You see, compassion is it's not just something that has descended from heaven.
It's part of who we are.
It is in our brains. Neurologists find that it's seated in the right hemisphere of our brain, and together with religion, poetry, and music, all of which come from that part of the brain, and it was given. We developed this for a reason, to try to inhibit the ferocious tendencies of our species, and also to nurture the young and look after the old, which demands a great deal of
then in Islam,
selflessness.
you must find a huge affinity with Sufism, which focuses on the very notion that it is love and compassion that can compel a person to change.
I'm a bit wary of the word love, to be honest. It's probably maybe
because
different.
you feel it's used for romantic purposes.
Romantic purposes, or you say I love ice cream, and you love that movie, and it suggests something that is sort of a surge of emotion. Whereas compassion, it's something that you do, and you may not be feeling
Does compassion come with sacrifice?
Yes. Yes, it
sacrifice
has.
is
You
a
have to put
component.
your ego on the back burner. As the Charter says, dethrone yourself from the center of your world and put another there all day and every day. But if you do it all day and every day, you get intimations of enlightenment. But what happens today in religion is that largely because, and this may be just a Western phenomenon, particularly in the United States, that because we've separated religion and politics, and I'm all for that, I think to separate religion and politics liberates religion from the tyranny and injustice of the state. But that doesn't mean we should all go skulking off into our little pious burrows, because all the scriptures that I've been studying for my new book insist that religion is not a private search, as John Locke claimed. It is something that compels you back into the marketplace to work compassionately for the betterment of others.
And yet religion and politics are two subjects that are never really discussed in polite settings.
And what's happened, you see, in the United States is that because, we don't want to get political, so what they do, what's happened, there was a series of interviews done in 2002, 2003, that found that the most predominant religion of teenagers and some of their parents was something they called ethical monotheism. Well, you've never heard of it, of course, but it says that God loves us. God wants us to be happy. And God's job is to make us happy.
The same way that you are a bit, you're not very comfortable with using the word love, I have that sort of discomfort with the word happy.
Yes.
Because I find it used in manners where I don't know how to quite explain it, but the goal of life
is happiness.
is happiness.
As the American Constitution says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that has contributed to this. But self-indulgence,
Absolutely.
So that Jesus, they say, is my personal saviour, working for me on an individual basis, rather like a personal trainer in the gym. Instead of driving you out to, as Jesus said, I was hungry. On the last day, you'll be judged on your kindness to others who are suffering. I was hungry, he said. You gave me to eat.
There's more happiness in giving than there is in receiving.
But yes, indeed. But also it often demands sacrifice.
Absolutely.
Real
That's why I said
sacrifice and courage.
And courage.
And courage. So that that religion should be pushing us all to work creatively in whatever sphere we find ourselves for a better world.
I believe that religion truly does do that. Unfortunately, I think it's misunderstood.
Yes.
And what we are taught about religion, and as you said, the pursuit of selfish happiness
Yes.
is never going to lead us to a better world or a compassionate world.
Or an emphasis on your own personal salvation.
Right.
Instead of saying, I will gain salvation by helping others, and losing myself, dethroning myself from the centre of, well, otherwise, the religious quest can become a sort of utterly selfish exercise, where instead of losing the ego, as all the faiths tell us, we're working for its eternal survival in optimum conditions. So that the ego, when you let it go, you discover a sense of liberation, and compassion is the best, safest way of getting beyond the ego.
Well, I do look forward to your next book, which you're working on, and it's truly amazing that you've taken out this time again, because I can imagine how difficult it must be while you're focused on your study from 9 to 5 every day, especially with this book. My final question to you would be, you've explained your theory of compassion, what the Charter of Compassion does, your own personal journey, which is rather inspirational, a story of resilience and hope. What would you like to say to the Pakistanis that are watching this and who have now actually heard that Pakistan's chapter is the most active one?
Pakistan is not only the most active, it's also the most brilliant and effective. I've seen extraordinary things this last week. I've been into the hospital where they've adopted some of my stories, my principles about teaching compassion in my book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, and they've adopted it for patients, nurses and doctors, and the relationship between doctors and nurses and the administrative staff has dramatically improved. Children are being sent home early because of compassionate treatment in the ward, because that is a healing process. The bridges, I've already spoken to of that extraordinary thing. The schools in Pakistan, which are incorporating compassionate teaching into core subjects of the curriculum. Mm-hmm. And are training children to think in a different way and helping them to build bridges with one another, with the privilege of learning to play cricket.
Pakistan is in a process of healing. Unfortunately, it feels that it's misunderstood in the world. How do we change that?
You are changing it.
We are changing it.
You are changing it. You are world leaders in compassion. And the fact that that is happening on the cusp of so many of the problems that are tearing our world apart, and in such difficult circumstances, is an extraordinary tribute to the resilience of the Pakistani people. I can't wait to come back and see what I'm going to see next time, because I take this back and I look at some of the other initiatives with shame, really, because people are not working with nearly the same difficulties and have produced nothing of the excellence, of compassionate excellence that we are seeing, but it's practical. And one of the reasons why it's worked is that businessmen have have taken a hand. I just spend my life reading books and studying. I'm not a practical person. But business people know how to craft a project. They know they're not afraid of failure, because you have to pilot something and maybe it'll fail, but that's not the end of the world. And they're used to translating an idea into something that is practical and effective. And that is what
And you
is what
found
we need.
all these attributes in Pakistan. Thank you very much for having taken out the time. Again, I wish you safe travels and a very successful book.
Thank you.
That I look forward to reading. We were interviewing Ms. Armstrong on her visit to Pakistan. The core reason behind this visit, as discussed, was compassion, but within this interview, I believe, for all of you who are watching, there were many other lessons to be learned and to be inspired by, her own personal journey being one of those. As always, I truly hope that we're headed towards a brighter, safer, and more prosperous future. Thank you for watching. See you next time.